welcome to the inaugural Socium Tech and Transformation podcast. It's going to be a series of releases over the next few weeks and months. And today we're joined by Damian Fessey, who's a seasoned hot seat practitioner in transformation and change delivery across government, private sector. We are going to be talking today about change delivery and how the stakes have gone up in light of recent events and the unprecedented changes that the world has seen, and the new normal that we find ourselves in today. It's going to be a 6-part series talking about the 6 themes which we've identified as the key changes in how organisations and government departments are going to have to adapt and morph in order to be effective at delivering transformation in the future. So, without further ado, welcome, Damian.
Good morning. So, I think just to start, I'd like to explain what we mean by the stakes having gone up. So, if you wind the clock back to 2008 when the financial crash, or 2001 when the dot-com bubble burst, the economic challenges then were somewhat different. Essentially, your ability to survive depended on how well run your business was, and how leveraged your business was, i.e. the amount of debt that you were carrying. It's probably going to be a different game over the next 2 years. It won't be based quite so much on those criteria. It'll be more to do with how adaptable your organisation is. In other words, how well you execute on change. So we're at a point now where, certainly in the UK, we've got retail businesses reopening as of last week. And we're on the verge of that situation where business is about to restart in earnest, with some support from the Bank of England. So, the predictions abound, but just to quote Forbes as an example, the rush to re-establish business value in the market will result in a fast flow of ideas and ingenuity to figure things out and make things happen. That's the direct quote. Now, there's one blooper in that prediction, which is that things don't just happen in business. If you are going to execute effective change, it's going to impact every aspect of your business, including your vital organs like your customers, your employees, and your reputation. And therefore, to make it happen, it requires quite a bit of choreography, or in conventional parlance, change delivery. So for that reason, change is about to become more important as an organisational capability than it's ever been before. So if you factor in the current level of what's commonly being termed VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, the real test here for any organisation, the real challenge will be how adaptable they actually are. So with all of that said, the question is, okay, so we've now emerged from lockdown. What's going to be different about the way in which we deliver change? What's going to be different from what we were doing back in February of this year, which, let's face it, was not particularly long ago. So we've come up with 6 predictions about the key things that will change. First prediction is that the home team will become much more important in delivering change. So if you think about historically the role that the organisation's own internal team have had in delivering change, it's usually a combination of subject matter expertise and recipient of the change. It's less common to find that the organisation actually drives the change, i.e. the programme managers, the project managers, the business analysts. Those functions are quite often sourced from outside, on the grounds that it's a job for the professionals. I think one of the interesting developments over the last few months has been the way in which the internal teams within organisations have stepped up very strongly and have even surprised their own management in terms of their capability under pressure. And that, I think, will inject a certain confidence in terms of organisations' ability to execute change internally. So the conventional stance of leave it to the professionals and bring professionals in, I think, will be replaced by more of a willingness to engage the internal team more directly, not just in assisting the change, or playing the subject matter expert role, but in actually delivering the change. Now, the only catch with that, of course, is that's something new for a lot of people that have not been skilled up for that. Doesn't mean that they can't do it, but it does mean that some thought needs to be put into how they are supported, how they're trained, how they're led through that challenge. And it goes a lot further than just a Prince 2 course. I mean, we'll come on to it in a later session, but there is quite a bit involved in terms of mobilising that home team.
Of course. Which brings us nicely onto the second point.
The second point, I think, is going to be a very interesting one. That's change governance. If you look at the way that change governance has operated historically within most conventional corporate programs, it's a relatively formulaic thing. It happens once a month. The program board members are drawn from each of the main functions: finance, risk, etc. And they'll come along to program board. There's a deck. They read through the deck. They get a bit of an update. They'll ask a few questions. They'll discuss a few problems. But typically, you're dealing with something that already has a plan where the decisions are kind of baked in. So if you consider just how volatile things may be over the next 18 months, you probably are going to have to make some fundamental changes to programs once they've actually set out. There are going to be some fundamental decisions to be made there. And that's a much more active role for your governance function than has typically been the case. Now, one thing that really struck me was an article that Amy Malloy, one of the professors at Oxford, published last month on LinkedIn. And it was an observation that has been made many times in the past, but I hadn't heard it for a while. And that's the point that knowledge and ignorance increase proportionally. So, in other words, the more you know about something, the more questions you have, and typically unanswered questions in many instances. So you're often in a situation where you feel you don't have enough information initially to take the decision, and therefore you defer it until you have more information in front of you to enable the decision. But at the same time, you also have more questions. Mm-hmm. And through the course of the next 2 years, with all of that volatility, there will not be the luxury of waiting. The decisions are going to have to come quite quickly over that period of time. So that's a new challenge in the sphere of governance that we've simply not had before. Programs have typically tended to extend often by 30, 40%, simply because of the amount of time required to take the decisions to get through the governance hurdles. So that certainly will be different. The real tip here is it's probably time to revisit how your governance actually works and how that actually enables timely decision making.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it for years, right, where the program itself can be the reason it stalls because of, particularly in government, things like gateway and review processes taking longer than perhaps they should do, and no decision being worse than, in certain circumstances, a less than ideal decision being made. So I think that's a really apt point. And the third prediction we've come up with,
Well, third one is that change leadership will professionalise. So if you look at the overall process of professionalisation, take doctors or lawyers, professions always originate in people who simply know more about it than anybody else. But there comes a point at which it enters the mainstream, or it's so vital to society that it becomes professionalised. And you could say that with project and program management, to a certain extent, it's professionalised. And yes, that would be true. There are formal qualifications, but those qualifications are relatively short. So somebody, for the sake of a week's Prince 2 training course, can emerge from that with a practitioner certificate, and then the rest of it is on-the-job learning. And whilst that's a very valuable way to learn, it's not a particularly good way to deliver a consistent approach to something and then refine that consistency down. So if we're entering an era where the importance of change becomes much greater, then the chances are that will be accompanied by a surge in the move towards professionalism. If you want to see a good example of this, I'd point to the UK government's approach. So they have been now undergoing a much more rigorous approach to change for approximately the last 7 years, where they've had the Major Projects Leadership Academy, which educates not only the people who are delivering the programs, but also the people who are sponsoring the programs, the SROs. So we've seen that approach then adopted by some corporates. So there are private organisations that also have their own academies, and those are for their, not just for the project managers, but again for their project and program sponsors. But I suspect we will see that trend continue, because it's just too important to leave it to the randomness of an individual's on-the-job training.
Yeah, and I think you've seen that in recent years with private people from private sector, or companies in the private sector putting their leadership teams through the MPLA Academy, or to themselves, or people from government moving it into private sector, and companies seeing the benefit of that. So yeah.
So the fourth area that I'm quite happy to put some money on is around supplier relationships. Now, supplier relationships are quite important in program delivery anyway, because it's, given the size of the budgets, it's typically quite difficult to spend the money or make the progress without the engagement of suppliers. But if you think about the supplier landscape and what the last 3 months and the next 2 years will do to the supplier landscape, the chances are that we will see it start to polarize. So to give you an analogy here, and I'm quite pleased I managed to get 12 minutes into this podcast before resorting to an analogy. There was something that they used to do.
I just wonder how long it would be.
Have you lost your bet or won it?
I thought we would be maximum of 3-4 minutes. So we've yeah.
Okay. Well, there was a little trick that they used to do in special forces training back in the 70s and 80s, before it was broadcast all over the internet or published in books by Andy McNabb. So what they would do basically is, during the interrogation phase of the training, they would march the candidates out to the railway tracks, and the candidates were handcuffed and blindfolded, and then they were handcuffed to the tracks. And a few minutes into the exercise, the candidates would feel the rumble of a train coming towards them, and the instructors would run around like there'd been this massive screw up. Quick, who's got the keys? As though something had gone very badly wrong, and all of the candidates were about to be mashed by an oncoming train. And the object of the exercise was to test how people reacted. So some people would panic and spread themselves across the track. Obviously, they would be just mashed when the train came. Some people would try and limit the damage, so they would extend their arm out with just their wrist over the track. So they'd lose their hand, but at least they wouldn't be killed, and potentially they'd even be able to escape. But the really smart ones would get one arm under the rail and the other hand then back over the rail, so that the links lay across the rail, so that when the train rolled over, it would sever the links, they'd break free, they'd be injury free, and they could escape. And it was really the third type of candidate that you wanted. But it's a very good analogy with how people react to changing circumstances. Some panic, some try and limit the damage, and some see the opportunity in it. And I suspect we'll see the same thing with suppliers. Combined with that, we're also going to see changes within organisations, which means potentially the things that they contracted with suppliers for a year ago on a multi-year contract, they no longer need. So there's going to be quite a bit of churn within the supplier community in terms of what they're providing versus what their client base really requires. But what that means within programs potentially is that for the first time in quite a long time, we have more leverage, or buyer leverage, than we've had. And the implications of that are quite far-reaching. I mean, in that situation, the danger is that you abuse the situation and you drive a very hard bargain. The real opportunity in terms of program delivery is to use that opportunity instead to ensure that you get the right contracts in place that drive the right behaviours and deliver the right outcome for all parties, so that there is that mutual benefit there. Now, all of that said, that's actually a rather simplistic way of articulating what is actually quite a complex scenario, and it's definitely that one is one for the professionals. So we'll refer any more detailed analysis of that scenario to a later podcast, if we may.
Of course, and I think there's been a lot of talk recently, and people harking back to the last major recession we had, and the drawing parallels between the two. Last recession saw the birth of what are now absolute behemoth of size businesses, and I think typically in these scenarios, the larger companies will fall into camps 1 or 2 in your analogy scenario, particularly probably the damage limitation one, and it tends to be the SME size businesses or even micro businesses that are a bit more adaptable, because they're typically led by an entrepreneur or still owner operated to some degree, and they have a bit more flexibility and ability to adapt to new scenarios, and there's less of that kind of having to steer the cruise ship through treacle. So I think it'll be interesting to see what that supplier base for your typical FTSE 250 company looks like in 12 months' time versus what it looks like now, what the supplier ecosystems are. I would imagine there'll be more of an SME component or growing SME component, perhaps, than what they would typically have had in the past.
If I was head of procurement within an organisation at the moment, I'd be doing almost what you do when you go in to renovate a new house. Take a photograph of everything before anything changes. If you photograph your supplier base as it stands now and look at it in 2 years' time, my bet would be they'll be very different. But a lot of that will be executed through programs and projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the 5th prediction, it's all around process engineering.
Yes. So process engineering has always been quite an interesting one for me anyway. I mean, I know people don't get overly excited about process, but if you have several thousand people working within an organisation, if there isn't some sort of choreography there that says, you go here on the pitch and do this, and you go here on the pitch and do that, then it will just never hang together. And the interesting thing has always been that when you talk to an organisation about its process maturity, the response is typically that they would not rate themselves very highly on the maturity scale. Anecdotally, from what I've seen over the years, that's probably a fair comment. But what that means on the flip side is there's actually significant headroom for improvement. And quite often it's improvement where it really matters. It's improvement, for example, in the customer experience, probably the single most critical thing over the next 2 years. The other point about process re-engineering is that it's actually relatively risk-free and relatively easy to do. You change something, if it doesn't work, then you tweak it, you rerun it. It's a very low-risk category of change with actually quite a high level of return. So on that basis alone, if you were looking to improve your organisation, there's the headroom to go and do exactly that. But there's another reason, much more fundamental reason, why organisations will probably become much more acutely aware of their business processes and also their capabilities in re-engineering. And that's if you look at certain industries, take cinemas, airlines, restaurants, they're all probably going to have to do with a few less bums on seats for the next few months. That means reduced revenue. And that in turn means that the only way that they can actually make themselves viable in the short term is to reduce their cost base. And again, one of the easiest ways to do it is process re-engineering. There is the added advantage with that if you invest in process re-engineering and process automation, that has both a short-term payback and a long-term payback. So it's not as though you're making a throwaway spend at any point in time. If automation gets you to break even in the short term, and it means that in the medium term you are profitable and you'll therefore make up some of the ground that you lost in 2020, it's a fairly easy investment decision to make.
Yep.
But you can't do any of that without having that capability and that maturity in terms of both business process re-engineering and also having the processes themselves nailed down. If you can't actually articulate what your processes are, and it's not that uncommon in my experience to find that clients don't have them particularly well captured, automating them is just nigh on impossible. To do it well, certainly.
Yeah.
So I think my main tip at the moment would be look at two things. The first is the actual maturity of your current process architecture, and secondly, your capability of your process re-engineering, because you're going to be needing it very soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's always in the top 3 or 4 things that companies that are trying to have a some sort of cost reduction based or efficiency based program is the process stuff, because you're doing more with less, and that's less spend on people and all the good things that go along with that. I think larger companies have been trying to re-engineer their processes for years, and it's a continuous thing rather than an event at a single point in time. And the ability to be able to continuously re-engineer your processes really separates the businesses that are good at it than those that aren't.
It's always been one of those poor cousins within the change community. I mean, but process should be absolutely central to change, because without it, I say, you can't coordinate the efforts of a workforce of several thousand people. You can't even coordinate the efforts of 10 people without process engineering. But it tends to get quite a bad press. It tends to be dismissed. The most cynical definition of process engineering I ever heard was a systematized way of working designed to frustrate 3 or more people. So whilst we don't like it, we certainly don't love it, I think we're going to learn the value of it over the next 2 years.
Yeah, I'd agree. And so the 6th and final prediction.
The 6th and final prediction is, so this is the contentious one. I think we're about to become somewhat less visionary in the conventional program delivery sense. So the way it works at the moment for any programmer, the number one word in buzzword bingo, the top prize, is vision. And it's ingrained into program management that you just can't function without it. There's got to be absolute clarity around what the vision is, and then you work back from there. And typically the situation that creates in practice is that you have a series of interconnecting steps extending backwards from that destination, and that in itself is fine, but it's very difficult to set it in stone, particularly given the current volatility. But it also creates a situation where the organisation then goes all in with the poker chips and holds its collective breath for maybe 2 or 3 years, which is the typical duration of a program, to see whether that outcome is ever actually achieved. And that's just going to be such a difficult thing to do in 2020, 2021 anyway. But even in good times, it doesn't necessarily get the best result. So if you take that poker analogy for a moment, what you want to be doing is spending a few chips, seeing some payback on that, then spend a few more chips, see some payback on that, and break it down into its incremental steps. So whilst you keep your end goal in sight, don't try and cut straight to it. Find the incremental improvement that gets you there. And the best analogy I can give you, I was involved with I was a director of a software house that we were turning around in the mid-90s. And there were a number of strategy decisions that we took that were good strategy decisions that made a material difference to the outcome. But the other thing we did was we got the line management together on a daily basis, and we took one decision a day about how we ran our business. So you'd got day on day that incremental improvement, and actually that probably had as much of an impact on improving that organisation as the strategic decisions. Now, if you've got an organisation that's not profitable, that's got a very low turnover, as this company did at the time, and you're looking to, we actually increased the turnover by a factor of 14 in 2 years. Logic said, and it was profitable. Logic says that that's a very different organisation at the end of 2 years, and you can't just change it to a different organisation by a simple set of strategic decisions. It's got to be incremental improvement, and that incremental philosophy, we've not seen that in the world of program delivery as part of the overall approach. And I think that's probably the single most important innovation that we'll see coming into change delivery in 2020.
Yeah, I think for years companies have always focused on the big monolithic tower program rather than the iterative compounding gains that you get from it being a constant. And certain situations where that maybe lends itself better to having a large tower program organization, ERP replacement or something like that. But if you take the view that in itself is an iterative compounding gain in a longer time period, it's perhaps organizations setting themselves up to think differently about how they are going about change programs rather than how they've always done it.
The thing I like about the incremental approach is that it gives you quite a fine degree of control. So your ability to adjust to changing circumstances is much greater if a component of the change that you're executing on is incremental and therefore can be adjusted day on day or week on week.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the 6 predictions. Damian, thank you very much for that. As I say, this is going to be a mini series, if you will. Each topic we're going to have another guest speaker alongside Damian, talking in detail about what they think that means for the industry in the next year, 2-3 years, which will be released weekly. So stay tuned for that, and thanks very much for tuning in.